So it's very much going to be a continuation. Because we go, this is how simple it is. This looks super simple, right? But have a look at how powerful the effect was on a clinical sample. So play it with your teams.
Oh, right, okay.
Why don't we put this first?
Then you talk to
we talk to our own
camera.
cameras,
Yeah.
not each other's cameras, our own cameras.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, roll.
Welcome to the next episode of the Mental Health Awareness Month video series that we are doing, Riding the Waves, Navigating Mental Health During COVID. Mark, how are you doing today?
Doing so well. Great to be back here with you again. Yeah, great to be having this chat with you, T.
On a scale of like 1 to 10, are you better or worse than you were when we did the last episode?
I think I'm about a half a point up.
Half a point up?
Yeah, I started on a 3, so... Oh, what was the scale? Was 10
know,
good or
10.
bad?
10, I don't know.
No, doing good.
However
doing
you
good.
want to interpret it. Just make sure.
No, I'm at 8.5.
Okay, good. No, I had a really bad day yesterday, actually.
Wow.
But I put some things in place today, we might talk about it later, to kickstart my mood a little bit. So I'm actually feeling pretty good.
Well done.
So I don't know
Well
what
done.
I was last time, but I'm feeling better this time. Okay, let's dive in. Riding the Waves today, we're going to be discussing some really interesting stuff, but let's do a quick recap. Just, it's been a week probably, or maybe not. Maybe people have been binging, but let's do a quick recap. I'm not going to spend too long on these slides. You can push pause and you can have a look at these stats, but these are some of the stats we were looking at in the last episode around where are we at right now, like taking a bit of a dipstick, taking stock of where we're at globally. This is these are US stats. This is interesting to see just the way that the generations have been impacted quite differently. It seems the basic rule of thumb is that the younger the generation, the more they have been, I was going to say the more we have been impacted, but I'm realizing I'm getting on.
You're getting on that
I'm
side.
Getting on. I'm young at heart. Anyway, fascinating. In the South African context as well, seeing how people have used coping mechanisms that perhaps have been a bit maladaptive and unhelpful.
Yeah.
And the summary for me was this figure, 56%, that across the board as a general stat, there has been for everyone an average of a 56% increase in stress as a result of COVID.
What really struck me in our conversation last time was just that it hasn't only been challenging for you and I think two people who really have practical aspects of life fairly pleasurable, if you like, but we've struggled as a company, even though we've got an amazing company we work with. Our clients have struggled. We've heard stories of people struggling, and the stats are starting to show that this has just been a tough time for everyone. And you summarized it with this word.
Yeah, stress. And we started here looking at the emotional intelligence skill of stress management, and we'll come back to the EQ wheel that we used a little bit later. You explained to us how stress works, this idea of appraisal, then primary and secondary appraisal, the way we understand the moment happens almost instantaneously together. We have these two, what did you say, simultaneous processes. We have a primary appraisal, the lion's coming at us, and then we have a secondary appraisal, it doesn't matter, it's a friendly lion. Yeah. It's a circus lion. He's just eaten. Whatever it is, that changes the way we see. Now this is sort of the jumping off point that I'd like to jump into today. How can we sort of hack this system? Because I think positive psychology has a lot to offer us in terms of how do we hack reappraisal? What can we do to reappraise the world? The theme for today is how you see matters. How you see yourself and how you see the world, how you see your context. And the EQ skill that this relates to, which I'd love you to speak to for a minute or two, is self-perception. This is sort of the start of the wheel. It's 12 o'clock. If you move around, we'll get to stress management. Once we build all these things in place, we'll be able to actually more effectively deal with our stress. But now we're starting back at the beginning. What is self-perception in a nutshell? Give us the layman's terminology here.
Well, I just think a little rhyme was super helpful for me to understand the concept of self-perception in EQ, and it's what I believe about and how I perceive myself. So what I believe and how I perceive myself. And there's something really powerful about the kind of inside-out way that emotional intelligence works, that unless there's a foundational sense of security in terms of the way I view myself, it becomes very difficult to interact effectively with the world around one. And we see this now in COVID. People's work lives, for those that have faced retrenchment, or their social lives, for those that are extroverted, have been significantly stunted. And what that's led to is just some very almost existential questions around, what do I actually believe about myself as a person? And so this is quite a fundamental root. Something that was interesting about that model of stress that you showed is it's actually called the transactional model of stress. Of course, we looked at that a bit more in the last episode. But it really is this transaction between myself and the environment. And depending on how I view myself, my self-perception, that's going to radically change the way I view threats in the world around me.
Now, one of the ways we explain EQ, in fact, the sort of micro definition, I might not get this word for word, is that emotional intelligence enables you to interact effectively with yourself and others, or manage your own emotions and interact effectively with others. Maybe you've got a slightly more succinct or better way of saying it than that. But it's not just self. And what's interesting is that the way the role that emotions play really is in that gap between self and other, between self and the world. So even though self-perception is about how you see yourself, you just raised it yourself now, but I just wanted to add to that, it's never about just the self. It's about how you see yourself in relation to others or to experiences. There's this research on learned helplessness that I'd love you to walk us through. This is fascinating, fundamental research for understanding how we interact with the world. Mark, talk to us about learned helplessness.
Yeah, I mean, this research has been something that I've just held on to as a lever to try and just understand my own experience of the world, and to try and, I think, summarize some of self-perception and how it starts impacting on the way we interact with the world around us. And so there was this research done, Martin Seligman, I see it was back in 1967, so this is a while ago. He created a two-sided dog kennel. You can see on the left side there's a shock plate at the bottom, and then the right-hand side is obviously no shock plate. And then in the middle there's this partition that can be opened or closed. And he was wanting to study just the response of a being to pain. What is our typical response to pain? He's a clinical psychologist, so he wanted to understand some of the clinical things underpinning pain and our responses to that. And anyway, this was before the days of ethics in psychology, so those were the good old days.
So they don't do experiments like this anymore?
No, they don't. But anyway, he put the dogs in the one side of the dog kennel, of course, shocked them, and they had a very natural response. They would jump across to the other side of the dog kennel to get away from the shock. That's a very normal response.
So we don't have a picture of a dog there, but you're saying there was a dog just above that little lightning.
Yeah, literally put in on the left side. They would put this kind of electric shock on, or a very uncomfortable kind of buzzing shock for these dogs, and they would, to get away from that discomfort, jump across into the other side. They would get away from the shock.
Because they can get away, there's an exit there.
Absolutely.
It's and like a two-room apartment dog kennel, that one, okay.
Then what was important, there was 3 parts to this research. The second part was that he closed that middle partition. In other words, he broke the system. He created a systemic blockage for these dogs to get away, so they couldn't get away. And when they realized that they were stuck inside this left-hand side of the kennel and they couldn't get away from the shock, they eventually would just kind of lie in the most comfortable way possible and obviously take the shock because there was no way out. But then the third part of the research, which became quite mind-blowing, was that when he opened that partition, in other words, it was possible for these dogs to get away from the shock. And he shocked those dogs again. Again, they had a very normal response. They carried on lying there taking the shock. And of course, this became labeled as learned helplessness, that these dogs had learned that they were helpless. And so when they were able to have agency, they continued with that mindset, that self-perception that I am helpless. And you know, this is, from my perspective, nothing more than a psychological paradigm linked directly to self-perception, and there are many like it.
And your own ability to interact with your environment.
Yeah.
So to summarize, put the dogs in the left, shocked them, they escaped, they jumped across. Broke the system, closed those 2 compartments so that there was no escape. Yep. Kept shocking them. They tried to escape, presumably for a little while. Then they learned that they were helpless and could not escape. Yep. And that psychological paradigm remained with them even when they were no longer helpless, when the system got fixed. And they could have escaped again. Didn't matter. They knew that all they could do was lie there and take the shock.
Yeah, and I mean, this might sound to some of the viewers like, yeah, great, a little experiment. What for me is profound about this is I grew up in a family where I couldn't get away from traumatic relational experiences. And so I lived with a learned helplessness around relationships and how relationships could be turned for the good. I see you've got work, home, and story. You know, people's work environments, many people either are in positions or have been in positions where they could not get away from the shock. It might be simply from just needing to provide for your kids and there's low employment in South Africa. You know, it might be practical things like that. But then when it becomes possible to move away from the shock, in a work context, we find that these psychological paradigms keep people bound in the way that they interact with the world. And it applies in home environments as well. I'm sure you've seen it in relational context, marriages, parenting, etc., etc.
Yeah. And I think for me, what ties it together is that word story at the bottom. There is a story at work, there's a story at home. And what we don't have here is just the story of the world, the story of the moment. It impacts us. It creates a way of seeing. And we're going to unpack a little bit more what that might look like. But let's dive into this idea of story. As I've mentioned before, story is one of the things that I find most fascinating as a creative, as a storyteller. The power of story is something I think is vital for us to understand. And it's not just how you see yourself. We were talking about the self-perception or perception of yourself in relation to the other. How you see the story of self and self in context, it matters. How you hear it, how you see it, but going further than that, how you tell it. In fact, we need to be careful here because we might be branching into the next EQ skill that we're actually going to deal with in the next episode, self-expression. But there is a very close relationship between self-perception and expression. But yeah, you've got your hand up.
No, I just wanted to jump in and say, you know, there's that proverb that says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And from a psychological perspective, I think of that as saying, you know, out of the overflow of the subconscious self-perception, we express ourselves.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. The way what we perceive and what we believe about ourselves in terms of self-perception gets lived out in terms of our behavior and the way we interact with the world.
Anyway, as we say, that's a little bit of a bit of an advert for the next one. We'll dig into that stuff as we unpack self-expression. The story matters. There's this quote by Epictetus, an old philosopher, super old philosopher, as you can see, 50 to 130 AD. People are disturbed not by events that happen to them, but by their view of these events. I mean, let's not take this too literally. Of course, we are at the mercy of the things that happen to us. If we're in a car accident, it's not just that we think we've been wounded. We may actually be wounded. It might be an objective fact. But I think what Epictetus is drawing out here is that the psychological dynamic will really make that a lot worse or a lot better. There are different ways to think about how you've been injured in a car accident. There are different ways to think and approach the moment that we're in right here. Great story is a story of David and Goliath. It's one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament in the Bible, and it's a great example of this idea of how you see really matters. So taking your story of learned helplessness, let's just combine these two stories together. Imagine David had the view of himself that said, no, I actually can't do anything about this moment. I can't do anything about this threat that is coming towards our people. I'm just going to lie here and take the shock. That could have been one way in which the story plays out. But learned helplessness is not the only way to think about a context like this. Learned agency, I don't know if anyone else says this, but I've just coined a term. Learned agency, the opposite of learned helplessness. In the story, in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel, the king is trying to say, oh, you're just a boy, you can't actually do anything, this guy's a giant. He says, no, I can do something. I've been tending the sheep for the longest time, and I've got my little slingshot, and when a lion came or a bear came, I'd just take care of it. The story gave David an understanding of who he was in relation to his environment. So, oh, this is just a giant, piece of cake. I got him. I've dealt with a lion, I've dealt with a bear, I can do this. This idea of learned agency, it's actually more about David than Goliath. Can you see that, what I'm saying there? It's more about the way he sees himself in relation to the world around him. Wow. And the hero's journey is a story structure that, probably the most famous story structure, actually, to be honest. There's a lot of different ways of crafting a story, but this one, I think, is very compelling and resonates with people a lot of the time. So it's become It's become the Rolls Royce of story structures. And we don't need to spend too long looking at the hero's journey, but essentially the hero is the center of the story always. And the story is about the hero. The story isn't about the plot. It's not about what happens. It's about what the hero does with what happens, how they respond, how they react. And in the hero's journey, you have these different props. You've got the enemy. Here we've got the witch, you know, the challenge, the obstacle. Maybe it's an ogre or a troll or a whatever. Maybe it's retrenchment. Maybe it's fear of COVID. There is some kind of antagonizing force, okay, which we're representing here as a witch. There's a mentor. You've got that old valley there who's bald with a beard. You've got your companions, and you've got tools. You know, think of Harry Potter with his wand, or Bilbo with his ring and his sword. There are different tools in the story. So as the hero goes through the journey, if the hero can see the story in a certain way, hear the story, and tell the story, the hero really tells the story. The hero's growth journey is what drives a story forward. The most compelling stories are always the ones where heroes grow. If they can do that, they can actually reappraise what they are seeing in the environment. So we talked right at the beginning, we brought this idea of how do you hack reappraisal, you know, from primary to secondary to change the way you see the world. Well, this is one of the ways you can do it. You can actually tell the story. You can translate and retell the story differently. Sorry, I'm speaking for a long time here. Jump in if you have anything to say, but I want to unpack this idea of narrative identity, unless you want to jump in and chat about it.
I just wanted to add, you know, this whole David and Goliath, I mean, it's so kind of echoing Malcolm Gladwell's kind of thesis in his David and Goliath book.
Yeah.
It may be where some of these ideas obviously come from. And he just talks about, you know, people in higher universities who are potentially more experienced, more academically savvy, if you like, than others. But because their perception of themselves in relation to those at Harvard is I'm not good enough, others who are less qualified, less IQ scores or whatever in other universities, who feel pretty good about themselves, end up outperforming those. And it speaks to the heart of exactly what you're saying, that this self-perception, this kind of inside-out view of oneself, the story, the narrative we live from the inside out, radically impacts on how we live.
Now, as we were saying earlier, this sort of bleeds into the next competency we're going to talk about, self-expression. So this episode might not be quite as practical, because the practical outworking of this is what you do to tell the story differently. But we're going to lay the foundation here, and we'll come back to it as we get into the next one. But this concept of narrative identity is something that Dan McAdams, he's not a philosopher, he's a psychologist, he's a professor at Northwestern University in the States. And I think this is sort of the main part of the corpus of his work, is this idea of narrative identity, the myth of self, the story we tell, how we tell the story about who we are in relation to the world. And he said there are essentially two different kinds of stories we tell: contamination stories or redemption stories. And I find this fascinating, because contamination stories start well and end badly. As you can see here on the left, starts very optimistic and then ends in denial and fear, etc. But redemptive stories, they might start in the pit. They might start in the valley of the shadow of death, but there's an optimism that leads towards a happier ending. And life, of course, isn't always about happy endings, but the point being that if you can frame the story of how you engage with the world redemptively instead of contaminatively, yeah. If you can do that, what it unlocks for you in a sense of learned agency is phenomenal.
Yeah.
So in his findings, let me just give you this next slide, which is a paraphrase of his findings. He says that people who tell contamination stories are less generative. They contribute less to society, to work, to home, to friendships. They coagulate. They go down into just protectionist thinking. And they're more prone to anxiety and depression. They feel that their lives are less coherent compared to people who tell redemptive stories. So if the story that you are telling, which again, I've got to hold myself back here because we're getting into self-expression, but if the way you hear the story, if the way you appraise it primarily is negative, well, you can do something about that. You can switch the way you tell the story. You can reappraise to be able to be more generative and to actually hack some of the natural tendencies we may have towards anxiety and depression. Give us a way that we can do this.
Well, what comes to mind for me is just some of the neurological reality around, neural pathways in the mind, and how the development of the subconscious mind from an early age can sometimes be primed quite negatively. We tend to focus more on the negatives than the positives, etc. And once we get into that flow of thinking, we can create neural pathways that actually prime us to interpret the world or our stories very negatively. Maybe
You've got this like template for a contamination story.
It would be like confirmation bias, where something happens and COVID is hard for everyone, but you interpret it as, look at what a loser I am because I got retrenched.
Because everyone else can deal with this except me.
Exactly. When actually the stats are showing everyone's struggling. And so a way of just like starting to rewire something is to use a very simple technique like this 3 good things developed by Martin Seligman, the same guy that did that research on learned helplessness. And you literally write down 3 good things that have happened in the last, 24 hours or so. They can be anything from a great cup of coffee all the way through to a deep and intimate conversation you've had with your partner. And then you write down why they were able to happen, these 3 good things. And what that starts doing is priming one to start seeing a different kind of story in the world around one. It can be a very powerful thing.
Okay, I want us to just pause on this word why. And the reason I'm doing this is because this is what everyone gets wrong. There seems to be a bit of a counterintuitive lens that we need to understand the why. Tell us again about the why. What is the why, and why is the why important in this technique?
I think it's just to dig a little deeper. I think I shared in the last episode, we've recently had this little boy in the last year. I'm going to mention him as often as possible. And I got home last night. Usually I do bath time and bedtime. Robin decided she was going to do the bathing for him because I had some work stuff I needed to catch up on. And now that might just be 2 parents and one of them bathed her son. Like, what's the big issue about that? But if you dig a little deeper, there's a long story over 5 years of entrepreneurship in my context where there's been massive sacrifice from Robin. Many times where I've had to work over hours and it's been hard for her. She's had to sacrifice that time with me. Oftentimes I haven't been able to go to certain parties or family things to work. And yet last night, once again, she was willing to lay herself down and give up her time when she usually relaxes to bath Eden. She spent the whole day with him, so a lot of self-sacrifice for me to just catch up on some work. It might look super bland, but the why of that means I've married this incredible woman who's able to lay herself down, who's willing to partner with me with this child, and suddenly the gratitude wells up in a different kind of way.
Yeah, what I was hoping you'd pull out, and you didn't, so now I'm going to pull it out, is that people often write why it's good. Not why it was able to happen. Mm-hmm. You could have framed this now to say, why was it good? It was good because I could spend another 3 hours on my work.
Yeah.
And we fall into the temptation of saying something's unpacking why it is good.
Yeah.
But that's easy. That's standard grade stuff. Why was it able to happen forces you to look at Robin.
Yeah.
And that's what builds relational capital. It's what builds relational resources. It's what builds gratitude. It's what builds commitment, intimacy, love. And if you can do that, you can start seeing an influence in the story. Tell us a little bit about this actual research. It's a nice idea, but is it something that's actually been tested in the lab, as it were?
Well, I mean, I think this is a particularly powerful technique to be talking about in Mental Health Awareness Month because the technique was actually tested on a group of clinical patients. You can see back in 2005. And again, this was Martin Seligman with a whole lot of his colleagues. And you can see they measured the depressive symptoms and the impact of this technique on a group of people that were struggling with depression. They had a placebo group, and these people would come in each day and just write down anything that was on their mind, they would write down. The other group, the 3 good things group, would come in and write down this technique, 3 good things that had happened and why they were able to happen. And have a look at what happened. You can see they did a pre-test on depressive symptoms. They did a post-test. This was after just 1 week.
So 1 week of journaling or writing, whatever that was.
Exactly. So just 1 week of doing this technique, telling a different kind of story, to use what we've been saying. Then they measured a week later, a month later, 3 months later, and 6 months later. And you can see that up to 6 months later, there was still a negative impact on depressive symptoms. So people were feeling less depressed, even up to 6 months later.
Negative impact, in other words, meaning a positive result.
A positive result,
exactly.
The
The depressive symptoms were getting smaller, negative impact.
Yeah.
but that's great. That's exactly what we want.
Yeah, and you can see that the placebo group stayed relatively stable over that time. So really a statistically significant impact of such a tiny little technique of just starting to tell a different kind of story. And if you have a look at what happened to the happiness levels, you'll see that there was a slow and incremental increase over a long-term period in the happiness levels. So just in terms of well-being, using a technique like this starts writing a different kind of story into one's life and starts allowing one to literally be able to process the world in a different kind of way. Very simple technique, very powerful impact.
Now, you obviously gave some personal examples. We gave a story example, a narrative example, but what we're really hoping is that you can take these ideas, take these tools. If you think of yourself with that hero, as that hero who needs that sword or that slingshot, if you're David, or that book of spells, or whatever it is that's going to help you. This is a tool like that to help you in the journey to tell the story differently. And our hope is that you can do this in your teams at work. We've actually created something called the gratitude game. We've got a couple of different versions for home, for personal life, but also for teams. A game that you can actually play. And we've done it with our team here at Migro. Yeah. It's a bit of a sort of like, I don't know, it's like a randomized kind of tool that you can click a button and then it primes you to look for something good. It's essentially a gamified version of the 3 Good Things technique. And that's available for you on the resources on the landing page of this episode. So make sure to use that and to start seeing the results of that. Anything you'd like to add as we wrap up this episode and say goodbye?
Yeah, I think what I'm struck by in today's episode is that we actually can write a different kind of story. I think of that quote you shared from Epictetus, that we're not disturbed by the events that happen to us, but by the way we see those events or whatever. It reminds me, it goes back to Stephen Covey saying the way you see the problem is the problem. And that whole kind of philosophy resulted in rational emotive behavioral therapy of Albert Ellis, that you can actually reinterpret or dispute a negative story and tell a different kind of story. And it can actually change the health of our mentality or the mental health.
And we're going to look at that in the next episode. We're going to be exploring some stuff around self-talk, around how we actually can change the way we express ourselves in relation to the giant or whatever it is that's in the context of our world. So make sure you come back for that next episode. We will see you then. Until next time, keep well.